Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Brether, and I'm going to be presenting on dyslexia and effective intervention. I am so honored to be here at the 2024 Patent Literacy Symposium. And we're going to start right away. There is a lot to cover in the hour that we are together. Let's go. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I'm presenting today at the Patent Symposium and how did I become an advocate. I consider myself an advocate when it comes to the science of reading and dyslexia awareness. And here you can see a picture of me wearing a shirt that says dyslexia doesn't come with a manual, it comes with a mother or father who doesn't give up. But I'll be honest, I needed that manual. As a mom to a child with dyslexia, my son is he's 13 right now, and he was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 9.5. And I did not know how to effectively help him learn to read. He was really having a great difficulty. I would say he's severely dyslexic. And I needed that manual. I needed to learn about dyslexia, but especially how to effectively help him. And obviously, it has transformed my teaching. So, just a little bit about myself. I am a full-time elementary resource teacher from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I work at a little school called Good Shepherd. I have been in special education, I would say the majority of my career, and I'm going into my 20th year of teaching, but I have taught many different levels. I have won in 2023 the NESI Dyslexia Aware Teacher of the Year, and just recently I won the Dyslexia Education Excellence Award from Dyslexia Canada. I am the founder of Decoding Dyslexia Quebec. Decoding Dyslexia is a grassroots movement that was started in the state. And there is one in every state, and there is in a few in the provinces of Canada as well. And I wanted to create a place for parents and teachers so they could learn more about dyslexia, because here I am in education and I didn't even know how to help my own son. So it is on Facebook, and I just share as many resources and information with parents and teachers. I did my training with the Orton Gilliam Academy Associate. I am an Acadians mentor recently, and I am a Surrey Structured Literacy Classroom teacher with the Center for Effective Reading Instruction. I am on the board of directors for Teachers of Reading Canada, which offers free Orton Gilliam training to Canadian teachers. I am on social media. You can look me up, Melanie Brether. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter or X. But I mainly share information and resource on my Instagram and Facebook page called Soar with Dyslexia. And it's all about the science of reading, SOAR, and dyslexia, but also literacy. And I share a lot of free resources, information for parents and teachers. My most important job is I'm a mom to two amazing kids. As I said, my son Benjamin, he's 13. He just started high school this year. And he is amazing, but he really did struggle in school and still struggles. This is definitely a journey for him and for me. And I have a daughter, Sophia, who is 11. When I say our dyslexia journey, I am not dyslexic, but my son, as I mentioned, is. And it's really difficult wearing two hats, because as a teacher, I want all students to come into school, love learning, love school. And when you see your own child at the beginning of grade 2 not wanting to go to school and seeing that social emotional piece, it really does break your heart. And here he is in front of a mosaic. I'm going to share a little bit about Benjamin and his talent later. But we wanted to, or I wanted to, with my husband, to share, awareness about dyslexia, because I didn't know that. And I thought, well, here he is, this amazing little guy, this amazing talent. And here he is wearing a shirt that says dyslexia is my disability crossed out and my superpower. And it is a journey. It's a difficult one. Any parent who has a child that's struggling in whatever area, it just breaks your heart. And that is why I am obsessed with sharing information and resources, because if I knew what I know now, I could have helped Benjamin early on. And obviously, as I mentioned before, it has transformed my teaching as well. I love this quote by Kate Wynne from the Reading Road Trip. And if you haven't listened to that podcast, it's from the IDA Ontario. It's fantastic. And there was one podcast that she shared this, and I thought, this is me. It seems like the ones who have children with dyslexia, children who struggled, they tend to be the earlier adopters because they figured out faster that it wasn't working because they could see it in their own home. And they knew that they were doing all of the other right things right, and that something just wasn't working. But I'm going to be honest with you, I wasn't taught how to teach reading effectively in my university program. And I didn't know for the longest time that what I was doing was not effective. It was just, I was taught this way, and I really didn't question it. I questioned it when I started to learn more about dyslexia when Benjamin was diagnosed. And this is why I want to advocate. I do have a lot of mom and teacher guilt, and I live by this motto: do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better. And I have had the honor of being on several podcasts, and one with Anna Geiger from The Measured Mom, a special education teacher's journey from balance to structured literacy. So everything that I'm mentioning today, I'm obviously not talking about everything, but I picked some of the best practices later on, because it really, my teaching has transformed. I would consider myself a guided reading guru before, and I am constantly learning and trying to make my teaching the most effective. This painting is by an artist, an Irish artist called Patty Donnelly. And when I saw this on social media, I immediately made an order, and I have this in my office, and it's called the Dyslexia Beach. And I just want you to take a moment to look at it, because this is the reason why I advocate, and this is the reason why I present. And just what are your thoughts, whether you're a parent in education, a teacher, anybody in education. And if you want to just, you can even put your thoughts in the chat if you want. I would love to read them later on. And if not, you can always message me afterwards. For me, I see two pieces wearing two hats. The mom, I see my son Benjamin there struggling to build his raft. And I see the students I work with as an interventionist trying to help them build their raft. And I think this symposium is bringing awareness of what we can do as educators to help all students build their raft quickly and early on, and early intervention. This is what the artist wrote, and I just thought it was really moving. I tried to capture the struggle a child with dyslexia feels when it seems like everyone else can assemble their letters with ease. I placed our main character sitting on the beach, surrounded and overwhelmed by washed up letters. He doesn't know where to start, while all the other kids have assembled rafts and are way on ahead. I first had the sand a normal color, but I disabled the layer, and having it totally white made him seem even more lost, empty, and alone. He's also holding the letter Y, as in, why do things not seem as easy for him? And I put him in a red shirt while all the rest are in blue to further separate him. And so how can we help our students, our children, to build their raft? And this is the first part of the presentation, where it's going to be, what is dyslexia, the signs of dyslexia, who can diagnose, how can we flag students, whether they're dyslexic or not. I will touch a little bit upon assessments and diagnostics, the social emotional piece, celebrating their strengths, and what happens when students get effective intervention. Hopefully we are doing this in all three tiers: the classroom teacher, and then myself, who does the tier 2 and 3, and some key takeaways and sharing free resources, which I love doing. As a teacher, I spend a lot of money of my own on many different things, from resources to PD. And I love sharing resources with teachers, hopefully free. And I made a Bitmoji classroom. You might have seen this on Twitter or some type of social media, where these are just some of my go-to dyslexia resources, some organizations, some of my favorite books, podcasts, courses. And you did receive this in the handout, in the sense that it's a PDF where it's interactive, and you can click on whatever you want and it will bring you to the link. The bottom right little TV that you see with the little faces, that is a video that we showed my son Benjamin, called Seeing Dyslexia Differently. And I have to say, some people I hear from, they don't want to label their child or get away from labels. But this video, when we showed Benjamin, what dyslexia was, it was almost like a weight was lifted off his shoulders. He finally understood why reading and writing was so difficult. And it's a fantastic video that's really appropriate for students. And it's called Seeing Dyslexia Differently. Every single classroom, you have students with dyslexia, whether they're diagnosed or not, and depending on the organization or where you live, but usually I see 1 in 5 students with dyslexia. So it's really important we identify students who are struggling early on, and we give them that effective classroom instruction, but intervention as well. This is the definition from the International Dyslexia Association, and I'm going to read it. It's dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, so you were born with it. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result in that phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. I get that a lot from teachers, my goodness, he's so smart. I don't understand why reading is so difficult. It's unexpected. These kids are bright. They have above average IQs. It's just their brains are wired differently to crack this code. And the secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. My son does not like to read. And I read to him his whole life, but unfortunately, he just doesn't like to read. So it's really important as teachers that we expose our students to that rich vocabulary, that background knowledge. And if they can't read, at level, we can give them audiobooks that give them that rich background knowledge and vocabulary that is needed. It's that Matthew effect, right? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And it's really important that we provide them those different options when it comes to reading if they're having difficulty. Dyslexia is a language-based learning disability, and there are no two dyslexics alike. It can impede reading, spelling, writing, pronouncing words, and spoken language, and there are many different layers. And it exists on a continuum from mild, moderate to severe. My son is in the severe category, and I think as teachers, he would be easily picked out because he's struggling so much. It is actually the students who are mild to moderate that I actually worry about most, because those are the students that can fall through the cracks if we're not paying attention to those red flags that we'll get into a little bit later. But it's really important that we can identify everybody who's maybe struggling a little bit early on, provide them that intervention. Doesn't mean they're dyslexic. It's just we want to make sure that we give them that intervention and instruction early on. Family histories, there's a 40 to 60% chance that a child will have dyslexia if one parent or grandparent has it. If both parents, it does increase. And what's interesting is my husband thinks he's dyslexic because he struggled in school and doesn't really enjoy reading. And many parents do realize that later on after their child's diagnosed. What's really interesting is in many meetings that I have with parents, they will actually open up and say to me and to the teacher, the classroom teacher, that, they're dyslexic. And that's just another red flag, a piece to the puzzle. I'm going to keep my eye on that child. I keep an eye on everyone, but I'm going to definitely keep an eye on that child to see, are there other red flags that we need to look in. And just recently, we did a kindergarten orientation at my school, welcoming students who are starting in September. And I actually had 2 parents come up to me, or parents, and they said that they're both dyslexic and they're worried that their child is dyslexic. So if parents say that they had difficulty in school or they struggled, or hopefully they can tell you even if they're dyslexic, it's definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. Dyslexia manifests as slow and inaccurate reading. It's a lifelong challenge. Students need appropriate and effective interventions. It impacts 1 in 5 students. It crosses all socioeconomic lines. It does not discriminate and exists on a continuum, as I mentioned, from mild, moderate to severe. Now, the term dyslexia, it depends. In Canada, we don't use the term dyslexia, it depends. And in the States, it seems to be that as well. Many public schools do not use the term dyslexia and instead refer to as a specific learning disability, which it is, in reading with difficulties in written word and decoding under reading comprehension. And in the United States, the term specific learning disability is used to describe students who are considered eligible for special educational performance and require specialized instruction. Specific learning disorder is an umbrella term that refers to the different kinds of learning disabilities, and there are multiple learning disabilities in reading. There's dyslexia, which is by far the most common. I was part of we were giving parents the results of an evaluation, and the psychologist said, your child has a learning disability. And the mom said, well, what kind? And she just said, well, it's dyslexia. And it just depends, but usually in any file, if you see a reading impairment, it usually means dyslexia. The National Center on Improving Literacy is a fantastic site. It has so much information, and it has this where you can, if you're living in the States, you can click on the state that you live in, and you can see what legislation's overview, dyslexia policies, screening policies, intervention policies, and state legislation. In every state, I think for the most part, they have their own handbook. And recently I was part of the Reading League, Idaho. They did an Idaho dyslexia handbook session where there were 3 sessions. And I just found it was a really good document. I'm sure there's other ones out there from different states. And this one is from just a little infographic adapted by Motes and Tolman, where the subtypes of reading and disability. So you have that dyslexia at the bottom, that phonological deficit that I underlined in the definition from the IDA. So 70, 80% of students or people have that phonological deficit. And there is also that fluency naming speed deficit, that RAN. And you can have both. My son actually has both. And even we went privately for a neuropsychologist report, and they did use dyslexia. They actually said a double deficit dyslexia, that phonological deficit and that fluency. But obviously, it does also impact language comprehension too. If students are having to decode and sound out every single little word that they have to read. The diagnosis of dyslexia must be made by a psychologist or a psychologist. I know that many speech and language pathologists in my province can diagnose dyslexia as well, but if anybody is seeking a diagnosis, it's important to ask those questions. And here are some of the signs that you can see early on. Remember, it's a language-based learning disability, so it's really important that we see those signs early on. Did I see these signs with Benjamin? I'm going to admit I saw some. I knew he was really struggling when he started kindergarten, but before that, in Quebec, we learned 2 languages, and I really dismissed it as, well, he's learning 2 languages. It's a little bit difficult for him. Trouble learning common nursery rhymes in preschool years, difficulty learning and remembering the names of the letters of the alphabet, seems unable to recognize letters in his or her name. Benjamin, for the longest time, did not want to write Benjamin because he couldn't write it. No matter how many times we practiced, it took a long time. So we would just, for the longest time, he would write Ben. Mispronounces familiar words like persistent baby talk, doesn't recognize rhyming patterns like cat, bat, and rat. Kindergarten, 1st grade, reading errors that show no connection to the sounds or letters on the page, difficulty learning the names of the letters and sounds. And that was a huge sign for my son. In kindergarten, he was really having a hard time remembering the letter names and the sounds. Does not understand that words can come apart, cannot sound out simple words like cat, map, and nap. I have a lot of students that I work with that they know all their sounds, they're sounding it out, but putting it together, blending is really difficult. They'll go, app, and then they'll say Pam, sometimes reading backwards as well. Does not associate letters with a sound, such as the letter B with the B sound. In 2nd grade to high school, and sometimes I see students kind of getting into grade 3 and grade 4, and that's when it's starting to fall apart. Those are the students that are, they may be mildly dyslexic, or they didn't seem to have, those really big flags early on. Very slow in acquire reading skills. Reading is slow and awkward, trouble reading unfamiliar words, and often making wild guesses. If they were taught 3Qing when it comes to guessing, then that's really going to be difficult because it's a terrible habit to break. I know that for a fact. Avoids reading out loud. If you are a classroom teacher, please do not call on students who are dyslexic, or you know that they're struggling to read out loud, it really is very stressful. And I tell this story often. I consider myself a proficient reader, and even in high school. And I remember the teacher calling on students to read a paragraph in a book and saying, you're going to read, the fourth paragraph. And I would make sure I would practice in my head. It's just really, really stressful for students. I do have students that actually will read raise their hands and want to read, which is fantastic. But I try to never call on anybody, and I always give that advice to teachers. Dr. Anita Archer, I heard her recently speak, and she had this great idea called me or we, and that's something you can definitely try out, where if you are picking students to do, whether it's to read out loud or participate, they can do a me or we. If they want me, they do it, and if they want we, the whole class does it at the same time. Trouble remembering dates, names, telephone numbers, struggles to finish tests on time because everything takes longer. Extreme difficulty learning a foreign language. Here in Quebec, we learn 2 languages, and I know many, people are learning 2 and 3 languages, and they are dyslexic. But this is something that my son definitely struggled with, learning a second language. Poor spelling, messy handwriting, and low self-esteem that may not be immediately visible. Studies have shown that undiagnosed and undressed dyslexia strongly correlated with heightened levels of stress and anxiety. And I experienced that firsthand as a mom. I see the impact it has on my son. And I've met many, many parents from all over who talk about the social emotional piece. And I don't think we bring that as much attention, because we need to remember that reading is a human right. Everybody has the right to read. And we, as those little rafts, we can help those students build those rafts. And it does increase their self-esteem by being able to read and do exactly the same thing as their peers. Imagine the constant confusion and self-doubt students with dyslexia grapple with daily. Reading is an integral part of every subject, but for them, there is a mismatch between how their brains work and how they're being taught. And here, I just wanted to put this quote by Dr. Sally Shea, which just saying that even in our society with technology, we still need to be able to read. And if you are reading fairly easily, it came to you, we sometimes take for granted. And I see how it impacts my son. He has made huge gains, don't get me wrong, but he still struggles. And just playing a simple board game, sometimes when we have family members over, he doesn't want to, because it especially involves a lot of reading. Sometimes when he's playing his favorite game, Fortnite, there's some challenges, and he'll say, "Ma, can you read that for me?" Going to the movies and reading subtitles, for example. So it's really important that we can teach these kids to read and identify them early on. Going to school day after day, week after week for years while being unable to read or read well is frequent and repetitive trauma. If you haven't listened to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy, you have to. It's a fantastic podcast. And one of them that I really recommend is with Steve Dykstra, where it's trauma and reading. And again, we don't always talk about this so much, but I've met so many parents who have gone through so much. Their child have depression or suicidal thoughts. And it's because going to school, imagine doing something day in and day out that's difficult. It would definitely do something to your soul at some point, and I've seen it firsthand. Some students who will struggle to learn to read most likely start their first day of formal schooling with a brain architecture that is less optimal for learning to read than that of their peers, which underlines the importance of early identification and intervention. And I think if there's one key takeaway, I have many today, but one of them is like really early identification, those students who are struggling, and intervention. And can we rewire the brain through instruction? The good news for people with dyslexia, we can rewire, and with explicitly teaches phonological awareness and decoding skills. And this is another great quote: teacher are brain changers. We have students with, those strong neural pathways, and then we have those students with weak pathways, and we want to be able to create those pathways by giving them explicit systematic instruction. And the brain has the ability to change and adapt as a result of an experience. And brain surgery by instruction. I'm sure you've seen those MRIs where they show what a dyslexic brain looks before intervention and after, and it's incredible. It's definitely intense intervention, but children with dyslexia usually have that phonological deficit that I spoke about before. This deficit causes word reading difficulties and increased activity in the right hemisphere of the brain due to abnormalities in the neural pathways. Unless brain circuitry is changed through intensive intervention, impaired readers compensate for their difficulties by using parts of the right brain that are inefficient for decoding words. There are many different accommodations for students with dyslexia. IDA, International Dyslexia Association, has a lot of resources, and here is one on accommodations that they give. But one of them that I always share is the provision of extra time. And as Dr. Sally Shaywitz says, basically dyslexia robs a person of time, accommodations return it. For the dyslexic, additional time is obligatory. Just imagine everything for many of students with dyslexia. It takes longer for them to write. It takes longer for them to read. So we need to provide them that extra time. Prevention, Stephanie Straller is presenting as well. And I love this quote, really important about prevention. If students are struggling readers at the end of first grade, they don't tend to catch up. Prevention is more efficient and effective than reading intervention. And again, going back to those three tiers, we want a solid classroom teacher that is doing explicit systematic instruction. And then if the student needs more, then they can go to intervention. Now, assessment is a whole other presentation pretty much, but I just wanted to share that I have made many shifts, moves, whatever you want to call it, from really a balanced literacy guru to I'm going to consider myself a structured literacy, not guru, because I'm still constantly learning. But an assessment is only valuable if we use the information to change outcomes. I made the shift. It's my second year doing it with my school, called universal screeners, and we're using Acadians. And I have to say it's a game changer because we are flagging all those students early on. Doesn't mean they're dyslexic. It just means we're going to provide them that intervention that they're needed. And I'm going to share with you this. This is by Dr. Una Malcolm. It's a fantastic document. And I just love how it's broken down into the assessment in the sense of universal screeners and the analogy that she uses. So I love this because it's like I'm taking the blood pressure and temperature of my entire school. I can see right away, is there a problem? What is the problem? And then we decide, those students, what do I need to do further? What's the problem? What do we need to do about it? That blood test or that diagnostic imaging, it gives you the examples of universal screeners, the diagnostic assessments as well. And it's just a fantastic, I have it actually printed and hanging in my classroom. And again, we're doing all this, something has to change, right? We have to look at it. I share the data with the teachers and we decide how are we going to reach all our students where they are at in their benchmark. Oral reading fluency, ORF, can a 1-minute assessment be so informative? I'm sure you've heard of Jan Hasbrook oral reading fluency norms. I have used that for many years as well, but with Acadians, they have their own oral reading fluency and they have their own benchmarks. And here I, listen to students read for 1 minute, their total words, their errors, words correct. The difference with Acadians is that there are benchmarks and they have that data over many, many years to say that if a student, for example, in grade 1 is not meeting the benchmark, is well below benchmark, they only have a 10 to 20% chance of reaching the next benchmark. And I had shared this with my school. I presented, why we're going to be switching to Acadians. And I said, we have a problem here. We have many students who are below and well below benchmark, and we need to make a change. And I'm really happy to say that change is happening. It can happen, even with our curriculum, which is very balanced literacy. And with an oral reading fluency measure, we can take, again, that academic temperature as in the previous slide as well. Now, if you're not using a universal screener, that's something maybe you want to consider, but I also have been using, just a simple diagnostics in terms of, my students know their letter names or sounds. And learning the alphabet is a foundational skill in reading. If we don't understand that printed symbol on the page, we cannot read the words and unlock the meaning. And the National Literacy Panel said that learning the alphabet was the #1 predictor of future reading success. There's so many different activities out there. And I always think of Anita Archer, teach the stuff, cut the fluff. Do I do some fluff in my class? I don't think I do. I just try and switch it around because they are 6 and 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds, and I want them to enjoy learning to read. So there's many different activities that I do to help them teach their letter names and their alphabet. And obviously their classroom teacher does that as well. Early intervention, children who are destined to be poor readers in 4th grade almost invariably have difficulties in kindergarten, 1st grade. So that's why it's so important that we identify these students early on. And they have difficulty with those phonological skills, the knowledge of letter names, their phonemic awareness, ability to hear and distinguish and blend individual sounds together. There are many free diagnostics. This one is from Really Great Reading, and it's free. It's called the Letter Knowledge Server. There's many out there, but this one I really like, and I use that often to see, again, which students are having difficulty with their letter names and sounds. I usually do this in kindergarten and the beginning of grade 1. And there are other diagnostics, again, from Really Great Reading. They even have a beginning decoding survey. There's core phonics survey as well that I really like as another diagnostic. And then Words Their Way, I don't use the program, but I do just use it as their spelling inventory. I find their spelling tells you so much, whether, are they missing their short vowels? Are they, having difficulty with their blends? And that's also free. Just a few reminders. The wait and see approach is really a wait to fail model, and we set up children with dyslexia even further behind with serious implications for the rest of their life. I taught grade 1 at one point, and I really used to say, let's just wait and see. They're a summer baby, they're a boy, they're immature. And there's, sometimes there's this light bulb that goes off at the end of grade 1. And I said that for quite some time. And I used to think that, you'll just, wait and see and they'll catch up. But it really is a wait to fail model. And we need to be transparent with parents and say, you know what, I'm noticing these difficulties. They're going to come for intervention and, they might not need it. And that often is what happens, which is wonderful. I want to see less students. Unfortunately, independent silent reading has not been proven to be an effective way to improve fluency. I used to do this as well. I would do a lot of dear time after lunch. They would come in, and I know that there were many students in my classes that were not proficient readers. They looked like they're reading or the behavior started. So it's really important to look at better ways to use your instructional time. Is this the best way? Or is there another way that you can organize it in your classroom? Copying off the board. I see this a lot with students that they're, writing in their agendas at the end of the day. I think with technology, sometimes it might be easier just to take a picture, send it to the parents. Sometimes some schools are getting away from homework. The task is really difficult for a child with dyslexia. Think of it. If they're having difficulty reading and spelling, it's going to be slower because a small portion can be remembered at a time. And like glancing up and down and losing their spot, right? It's really difficult. So maybe just be mindful of that as well, especially if you're copying something very long from the board. Should we have a child repeat? I had my son repeat grade 2, and I have, again, more guilt. If I knew what I knew now, I definitely would not have had him repeat because, one, he wasn't really getting the effective intervention at the time and in the class as well. So this might be the most detrimental thing we can do to a child with dyslexia. If a child with dyslexia is held back and the intervention is the same as the year before, he will not improve. The intervention has to change, not the child. Find their strengths. There's a book called The Dyslexic Advantage, and it talks about all the strengths. That it doesn't mean all dyslexic have all these strengths, but we definitely need to find out. It's easier as parents, but as classroom teachers too, to find out what they're good at. Please don't take away, going outside or, taking away art to finish up work. They really need to do other things that they enjoy. So my son, Benjamin, it has this amazing spatial intelligence. And I This is just my personal opinion, but I do think it's because he has dyslexia. His brain is wired differently, and he has this amazing spatial intelligence to make mosaics out of Rubik's cubes. And I always say that to parents. And, if I didn't give him that Rubik's cube, actually, my brother thinks he gave it to him, he would not have, would not have learned about this. So my son can make mosaics out of Rubik's cubes, and all of these are about 750 Rubik's cubes. The first one he did is of John Cena. And we actually made a video to spread awareness about dyslexia, saying, reading and writing is very difficult, and dyslexia is my superpower. Now, I'm sure you've heard that, some people think dyslexia is a gift. I'm going to say that, as Louisa Moat says, it's not. It's really hard. And again, depending on where you are in the spectrum, I'm going to say that it's really difficult for my son. But once we shared this, it kind of went viral. Even John Cena tweeted about him and said, "This is the embodiment of never give up. Benjamin demonstrates courage, perseverance, vulnerability, tremendous strength, and he's an artist. I admire you and your work and your outlook." He even became a Rubik's Cube ambassador, which was really neat. I'm going to say, unfortunately, he's not as into it as much now that he's 13. And he was even in the Nessie book, and it was just celebrating young people and their strengths. So I'm super proud of my son, and not saying that, this is what he has because of dyslexia, but I always think, he had such difficulty reading simple CVC words at one point, and look what he was able to do. So I'm really just, please find your child or your student's strengths. And he was on the cover of Distinct magazine as well, big picture thinking. And our journey continues. It's going to always continue. For example, he's right in the midst of studying for his exams for grade 7. And we are working on it. I'm learning a lot about geography and history recently. And I just, be patient with your children. If you're a parent listening, their brains are wired differently. This is not their fault. And we can help those students build those rafts. So just a few key takeaways. This is something I've had people ask me all the time. Did you read to your son? Yes, I read to my son. I read to him every night. We had a really rich literacy environment. And I have 2 kids, one who is dyslexic and one who is not. So even if parents read to their child at home or they are surrounded with good literature, a sizable proportion of our students need to be taught how to read. 90% of children with reading difficulties will achieve grade level in reading if they receive help by 1st grade. Again, that early intervention, early identification, and we do not need to wait for a diagnosis of dyslexia to help students as quickly and early on as possible. Effective reading instruction for students with dyslexia need to begin as early in a child's academic life as possible. Every year that intervention is delayed, it makes it harder for students to catch up. Again, this is the wait to fail paradigm, the wait to fail model. And again, these are in that little bit emoji classroom, but there are lots of free resources to share. There's one for teachers, there's one for parents, and I really love Nessie's Dyslexia Explain and What I Need. You can purchase them, but they're also free ebooks. Now we're going to get into the second part of the presentation. I'm just checking time. And this really, in a perfect world, I was listening to Lindsay Kemney's presentation. She's the classroom teacher and doing all these amazing things. I'm going to do the tier 2 and tier 3. And that it would be the most perfect world if we had that. And hopefully I would see less students because there's that strong tier 1 classroom instruction. Just to share what's the difference between research-based and evidence-based. Parts of the component of the program or method are based on practices demonstrated effective through research, right? The body of research called the science of reading. And then we have evidence-based, where there has typically been studies done, a randomized controlled trial that report on the program's effectiveness for the target population compared to other instructional approaches. I'm going to talk about a little bit about dyslexia. What does effective instruction look like in the classroom, and why it is essential for all students? I'm touching a little bit on the science of reading and structured literacy. There's so many incredible presentations today that you can get more information about that. Some best practices based on the science that you can use in your classroom tomorrow. And I'm sharing some of my best practices, but you can see a lot that I share on my Instagram account as well. Another Bitmoji classroom. This is on all the science of reading. Some of my favorite books I actually have to update. There's a few new ones out there. Some of my favorite podcasts as well, and just some free resources. So you can check that out. So what is dyslexia? I felt like I did that for the longest time. I did not know how to effectively help my students, and as I said, my son. So dyslexia is the misalignment between students who have been identified with dyslexia and the instruction they receive. Science has shown that dyslexic brains work differently, and the struggles with reading can't be dismissed as a lack of motivation and not working hard enough. Children with dyslexia cannot change the way they process language. And we need to remember that. I hear that often, they're not trying hard enough. They look lazy, they're unmotivated. Well, they are working really hard. And before I knew enough about dyslexia, I remember lots of tears at the homework table with my son because he was struggling so much, and my anxiety would go up because I was just like, he's not, I know what he, a grade 1 student needs to be at, and he definitely was having difficulty. And we would just, I would say, you just saw this word. You just read it, and he would not be able to read it. And we need to really understand what dyslexia is and that their brains are wired differently. I think it's maybe the most important finding in what we now call the science of reading, that we can prevent reading problems from almost the start. Again, Stephanie Stoller, who's presenting here as well. And this is the definition of the science of reading. I recently have had a lot of comments on my social media, and there's so many misconceptions about the science of reading. It's absolutely incredible. Sometimes I think we're making such great progress, and it's probably because I'm surrounded by many who, are considered advocates as well and understand the science of reading. And then I hear, you're taking away all the authentic texts, you're just doing phonics. There's so many misconceptions, but we need to remember the science of reading is the body of research into how we learn to read. And that based on this evidence-based best practice approach for teaching foundational literacy skills, that is called structured literacy. And I like this simple, the science of reading is not, and this is by the Reading Lead, it's not an ideology, a philosophy, a fad, a trend, a new idea, or pendulum swing. I hear that all the time. A political agenda, a one-size-fits-all approach. This is not for everybody. We have students in our classroom who are reading quite proficiently and beyond. I have students in kindergarten and grade 1 who are reading chapter books. So we also have to differentiate as well. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a program of instruction. I see that all the time. Science of reading, like that little stamp, or a single specific components of instruction, such as phonics. And this quote is fantastic. This isn't a pendulum swing. This is how we adjust our instruction to reflect our research. And I can say just from last year to this year, I've changed things around because there's research out there saying, maybe this isn't the best or most effective way. Teaching reading is rocket science. This is by Dr. Louise Moats, what expert teachers of reading should know and be able to do. This is a great article that you can read. And structured literacy is the approach to teaching reading that is based on the science of reading and years of research into how a child's brain acquires and processes information. And again, it's helpful for kids with reading challenges like dyslexia or who are at risk. We know that the research is clear that nearly all students, 90 to 95%, can be taught to read, and there are many students who are not mastering this fundamental skill. And structured literacy, I think many just think it's, let's sprinkle a little bit of phonics and we're good. It's very complex. And this is an updated version that you can download from IDA. And structured literacy approach emphasizes highly explicit and systematic teaching of all important components of literacy. And they include many pieces. So if you can see on the next page, I just took it, we're looking at the word recognition, the handwriting, the spelling, the comprehension, all that. And it's not just phonics. It's really complex. And reading is teaching rocket science. And I wish I almost filmed myself, just 5 years ago to now. My teaching has transformed. I am explicit. systematic, and I'm still constantly always learning and trying to perfect or almost perfect my teaching. I'm sure you've seen Nancy's Young Ladder reading. This one is from Texas Read, and it has the same numbers in the terms of structured literacy approach can help everybody in the classroom. And I'm sure you've seen that. There's about 40% of children who will learn to read no matter kind of the approach. And I've seen that firsthand. As I mentioned, I have students in grade 1 who are reading chapter books where their next door little neighbor is still having difficulty with learning their letter names and sounds. And I think, this is just my own personal opinion, is that's why maybe balanced literary has been around for so long, because it works for some, and then the ones that it doesn't work for, we might say, well, they have a learning disability or they're dyslexic. We need to provide that effective and essential instruction, explicit and systematic, for everybody in the classroom, and we can differentiate, but we really need to be able to reach everybody in the classroom. Reading is not natural. I used to think that it was. Human brains are naturally wired to speak, but they are not naturally wired to read and write. And students need to be explicitly taught how to read. Some students, as I said, don't need it or maybe not saying don't need it, but they can read very well early on, but they can still benefit from explicit systematic instruction and differentiation. So I was sold the story. I used to teach 3Qing. I remember holding up a book, teaching students to look at the picture. And you might have seen this little poster. I used to have it hung up in my classroom. I used to send it home, where I would tell students, if the word's too difficult, just skip a word, look at the picture, guessing based on the first letter. And then what is unfortunate is I reinforce that at home with my son. It is a terrible habit to break. And if there's one thing that you can do today, is to stop using the 3Qing in terms of having students use these to figure out the word on the page. I don't think any of us would look at a word that we didn't know and kind of guess, or look at a picture, we would sound it out and decode. I try and share as many resources, and I've tried even a lunch and learn with the podcast Sold a Story. If you haven't listened to Sold a Story, it's really a fantastic podcast about how we were sold a story. And I've done even a lunch and learn with my school, where I had teachers come in my room and we had lunch and we listened to the podcast. And I was fortunate to meet Emily Hanford as well. This is one of my favorite quotes by Lindsay Kemeny. When we teach our students to look at the picture, first letter of the word, skip the word, we are literally teaching them to read like a struggling student. That's what my son did for the longest time. And it's, as I said, it's really a terrible habit to break. So if we can stop encouraging this ineffective practice that I think many are still using, I would love to know the percentage. But if there's one thing that we can stop doing, is encouraging students to use these ineffective, quote, reading strategies. I have this in my classroom. My partner put this up: stuck on a word, we do not guess. And I try to encourage students to keep their eyes on their page. Many students look up. I don't know if it's for approval, but I say, you're going to lose your spot. You need to keep your eyes on the word, and we will work on it together if they're having difficulty. Informed teachers are the best insurance against reading failure. While programs are very helpful tools, programs don't teach, teachers do. Now, when I left my university program, I did not know how to teach reading. I wasn't taught. It was really a balanced literacy approach in the sense of exposure to books, a cozy little corner. And I have learned so much over the past, 4 years, almost obsessively, as I mentioned. And I do think informed teachers are our best insurance. Would I have loved a program? Yes, it would have definitely helped me out. But it's really important that, as teachers, we are, today and the next 2 days, you're here learning from all these amazing presenters. Just to show you, I am really explicit and systematic. I follow a scope and sequence. I never had heard what a scope and sequence was before. I didn't even know the cat-kite rule of when to use the C or K or CK. When I used to teach it, it would just be, okay, this is the letter C, it makes the K sound, and let's just practice a little bit. struggling students are going to gain more from very explicit instruction than with discovery. If they had discovered it, they wouldn't have been struggling. And I love that quote too by Anita Archer. And that's it. I don't assume aside, as she said as well. I explicitly teach my students when to use, these rules and following a good scope and sequence. Now, I do not work for any
Melanie,
company. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're down to about 8 minutes left in the presentation part, and then we do have a list of questions for the Q&A portion that lasts 15 minutes. So
Perfect. I think I'll be done.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Again, I don't work for a company. These are all, as I said, a true balanced literacy teacher, a guided reading teacher where I would do that. And over the years, I have, with my own professional development, I started with the Orton Gilliam Academy. My son was my little guinea pig during COVID. And I have, in some of my groups, started using UFly. And you can see on the right what types of what is the lesson from beginning to end. And I find it's very systematic. Just to show you, my phonological awareness drills have changed over the years. I was using close your eyes in the dark, about 7 minutes of just those phonological awareness drills. And just with the research, we know that we don't necessarily need to do that, right? And here at the beginning, at the beginning of UFly, there is some phonological awareness drills, but they really just last a minute. And here I'm using magnetic tiles.
Fit. It. Fit.
And then I moved on to trying to get students to use graphemes as much as possible. So phonemic awareness instruction, remember that students have that phonological deficit, 70 to 80%. And it's really important that how much phonemic instruction is enough. So does phonemic awareness instruction assist children to learning to read? Yes. Results of the meta-analysis show that teaching children to manipulate the sounds and language helps them learn to read. But do we want to do it with or without letters? I did it a lot without letters, but I've made that shift this year. So you can see a student actually writing it down on those magnetic tiles, or I would write it down or use Post-it notes. And the National Reading Panel showed that the PA instruction was more effective when taught with letters. Using letters to manipulate phonemes helps children make the transfer to reading and writing. And to ensure the instruction is phonemic awareness is effective, it needs to include instructions in graphemes as well as instruction in the connections between graphemes and phonemes. And phonemic awareness helps all types of children, from preschoolers, kindergartens, first graders. It's just something that is a really important piece that I use in my lessons. Just some elements from a UFly lesson. We do the visual drill where students have to say the sounds, and making sure we teach them and model the proper way to say those sounds. Many add that schwa. It's really important to make it very crisp and clear. We do auditory drill where I say the sounds and they can write it down on a board in sand. And then we have blending drill. We want those students to be blending and reading based on our scope and sequence so they can have practice. I'm just going to skip that one. I have a lot of different activities that I do in my classroom. Again, teach the stuff, cut the fluff, but I use a lot of different activities for them to practice. We want them to practice lots and lots of repetition. So this is a tap it, map it, say it, and students are doing it on the board as well. Here, a tap it, map it, zap it, where I'm using magnetic bingo chips, which they just absolutely love. Again, how many sounds do you hear? And then they write the grapheme that represents those sounds, base 10 frames. Here, phoneme graphing stamping, I'm making my own little magnets as well. And you can see a lot more ideas on my Instagram account as well. So why is this a good activity? On the left-hand side, you can see where I actually told the student which sounds we're going to be working on, and then they write the grapheme. And on the right, these are mats from UFly where we're doing that word chaining. Phonemic awareness is the ability to identify, hear, and manipulate the individual sounds in spoken words. Manipulating the sounds in words include blending, stretching, and otherwise changing words. And you can find free word chains from the 6 Shifts or Dyslexic Logic. And I heard Matt Burns talk, and he said the trinity of phonemic awareness, the building blocks of being a good reader, are blending, isolating, and segmenting. Decodable books, I'm just going to touch a little bit upon that. It's really like the training wheels for students. And because I work with students who are struggling, I use decodable and decodable text a lot because they are having difficulty with that word recognition, that word decoding piece. And I just saw this, I created a video where I was like, do I get rid of my level text? I saw many people were getting rid of them, throwing out them. And before they were called level text, they were actually just called books. And there's a way to repurpose your level text through different, genres or different, you can put different ones like in different bins and saying this is about, forests and this is about Star Wars and all that. Lots and lots of practice. We are constantly circling back to make sure our students are having that practice. We're not just moving on and forgetting. They do the roll and read, which is from UFly as well. They even have decodable text where the pictures are taken away, which I actually prefer. And here students are highlighting the concept that we're working on. I use even invisible pens for students. And I always joke to their teachers, they didn't do any work with me today. Practice makes permanent. It is impossible to overestimate the value of practice when developing or reinforcing a skill. And that's it. We practice a lot. We're always circling back. I'm always revering the concept. And I think Holly Lane might have mentioned this, on the right as practice makes permanent, where we have, and she said these numbers were too neat. I created an infographic based on a principal primers for rating reading achievement. And these numbers are made up. So just be cautious when you're looking at or listening to somebody, because these numbers were actually made up. She's not disputing that repetitions are important, but where did they get these numbers? I'm just going to skip a little bit about heart words and red words. Instead of students memorizing words, we want students to sound out those irregular words, even if there's 1 or 2 parts that are a little bit tricky. And Really Great Reading has some free resources as well, including videos. And I use this just little hearts with my students where I say, right now, this is a heart word because I haven't taught you that concept yet, but eventually it will not be a heart word for you because you know how to read it and write it. So what can you do tomorrow? Students, we need to stop memorizing words. I used to send those home, those flashcards, those phonological drills a few minutes a day, but with letters as much as possible and those word chains. Orthographic mapping, it's the process where we can use alkaline boxes and just having students count those sounds and write those graphemes. We want them to be able to manipulate and play with the sound structure and language, and using decodable books instead of leveled readers, especially our emergent readers or struggling ones. And just a few, I'm almost done. You are teachers, not discoverers. Students should not have to win the teacher lottery to have a fair shot at learning to read. The school that's on the slow road to better instruction is sacrificing another year of children. Reading influences every aspect of your life, and it's a human right to be able to read. And this one always gets me a little emotional. There comes a moment when you realize that what you're advocating for is more than just accommodations. You're really advocating for someone's quality of life. That's the moment you realize you won't give up. And you can find my information on Linktree. I have many free resources, and you can always contact me. I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody. If you want to give me some feedback, there's a QR code, and you did receive all these slides. I apologize for skipping over a few.